Yeah, so I want to talk today about Britain's role in Latin America, and particularly about how the British media represents Latin America, or misrepresents Latin America, to put it a bit better. And as Jeremy said, it's an exciting time for the Latin American left, and that means that the forces of reaction, the force of the US, the Latin American right, and the UK are going to push back incredibly hard against this second pink tide. And the media is going to function as an incredibly important organ of this pushback. So I want to start with a quote from Noam Chomsky, and then I'm going to elaborate with it to explain how the British media reports on Latin America. So the quote is, "The basic principle, rarely violated, is that what conflicts with the requirements of power and privilege does not exist." So simply, some uncomfortable facts simply do not exist in the British media about Latin America, and that's specifically about British foreign policy in Latin America, British involvement in coups across Latin America. And so the UK and Venezuela is an incredibly important case at the moment. As I'm sure you all know, in January 2019, Juan Guaidó pronounced himself Venezuelan president. He'd never ran for office in his life. One poll actually put it that 20% of Venezuelans had actually heard of him. However, under US pressure, Britain was one of the first countries to recognise Juan Guaidó as president, and actually continues to recognise Juan Guaidó today. And in 2020, I revealed that there was a secret unit within the British Foreign Office called the Venezuela Reconstruction Unit that was basically designed for the economic and social reconstruction of Venezuela. Later revelations showed that their discussions focused on British control over Venezuelan oil supplies. As we know, Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. This caused a diplomatic scandal between Venezuela and Britain. The UK charge d'affaires, Duncan Hill, was summoned to the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry to basically explain himself, to explain why the UK was planning to reconstruct another sovereign country. And this fell on deaf ears in the British media. Nobody reported on it, even though it had caused something of a diplomatic crisis. But this is also the case in terms of the negative effect of sanctions on Venezuela. So in January 2019, once again, under pressure from the US, Jeremy Hunt, our then Foreign Secretary, agreed to freeze roughly $2 billion worth of gold held in the Bank of England. That remains frozen there, and it looks likely that they're going to actually hand it over to Guaidó, even though he's in charge of no functions of the state. And since then, CEPR has done a study on the impact of sanctions on Venezuela. They found that over about 18 months, 40,000 people had died as a direct result of European and US sanctions on Venezuela. It fell on deaf ears in the media. Shortly afterwards, the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures, otherwise said sanctions, did a report on the impact of sanctions on Venezuela. And what she found was that once again, numerous deaths were being directly related to sanctions, and she specifically urged the UK government to unfreeze the gold in the Bank of England so that Venezuela could provide and buy crucial medicine and food. Now, bear in mind that in 2018, the total value of food and medical imports to Venezuela was $2.3 billion. So we're talking about roughly the entire value of Venezuelan food and medicine imports is frozen in the Bank of England. Now, once again, the UN Special Rapporteur's report was totally ignored across the British media. So you have a kind of a litany of articles about, and obviously there is clear suffering in Venezuela and economic suffering, but there is never discussion of responsibility for this. And of course, Britain is partially responsible for what is happening in Venezuela at the moment. Now, this also happened with the coup in Bolivia. There was a second coup in Latin America in 2019 in November. And a colleague of mine at Declassified UK, Matt Kennard, wrote an incredibly important article showing that Britain had supported the coup in Bolivia to get control of its white gold, otherwise said lithium, which is an incredibly important material for car batteries, phone batteries, and so on. And once again, this caused a bit of a diplomatic scandal, and there were protests in Bolivia outside of the British embassy, totally ignored by the British media. So when I tell people my focus of journalism is about British foreign policy in Latin America, they say, what? I didn't know there was a foreign policy in Latin America. Well, this is one of the core reasons, because British malfeasance and malign actions in the continent are systematically ignored by the media, and these are inversely proportional to the actual importance of these stories. The British public should be made aware how Britain is acting in Latin America. The second way that that what conflicts with the requirements of power and privilege does not exist is that successful alternative social and economic models simply don't exist. So in Venezuela in 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected. He stayed in power until 2013 and his death. As I'm sure many of you will be aware, many of the basic socio-economic metrics of progress improved, literature, housing, healthcare, etc. And so in a total of 304 articles by the BBC on Venezuela, a total of 3 actually referred to the socio-economic advances that happened under Hugo Chavez. And this was found by a group of academics at Cardiff University. Similarly, between 1981 and 1983, only 1 in 500 articles published in the Telegraph, the Times, or the FT mentioned the social and economic progress that went on under the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. 1 in 500 articles actually mentioned the improvements to people's lives that was recognised by all major human rights organisations, particularly Oxfam. So what you see is there's no discussion of the social and economic advances in Latin America, and the result of this is basically to kill hope about what is possible in Latin America, but also to send a message, or not to send a message to the British public about alternative successful economic models. A third way that this process occurs is that uncomfortable facts don't exist until their potency is lost. Now, there's a general perception that imperialism doesn't occur anymore, it doesn't happen anymore. It's a matter of 30 years ago, and that's the case for the US and the UK. The CIA doesn't engage in coups anymore. MI6 isn't interested in toppling leftist governments. And incidentally, the 30-year period is more or less the declassification process. So after 30 years, you finally find out what the government is doing in your name, and this basically shapes the perception of what is happening in terms of British foreign policy and US foreign policy. And you can see this in more recent terms as well. With the coup in Bolivia in 2019, the OS published a faulty report basically saying that Morales had rigged the election. Within days, it was possible to disprove the OAS's report. CEPR actually did it within about 3 days. However, it took the entire liberal media, The Guardian, the New York Times. I mean, The Guardian's diplomatic editor, Patrick Wintour, actually was tweeting, it's horrifying to see Evo Morales stuffing ballots, etc., etc. Whereas it could be proven at the time that the OAS report was faulty. However, the liberal media and the media writ large only caught up with this when it was too late, when the coup government was in place, and that nothing could actually be done about it. So what I'm saying is that the media is capable of critical analysis, but only at the point where it's not actually useful anymore, so it's therefore futile. And you saw the same with the case of Lula and Lava Jato. Independent media organisations like Brazil Wire, to which I contribute as well, and Natalia does, they were saying for a long time that the Lava Jato probe was corrupt in and of itself. It had ties to the US government, and it was clearly politically motivated to ruin the Workers' Party's chance of winning the 2018 election. And once again, it was clear that this was happening at the time, but it took years and the election of neo-fascist Jair Bolsonaro to be elected, and the damage was done before the liberal media actually caught up and reported factually on what had happened. And the fourth and final way that the media reports on Latin America is uncomfortable facts only exist when ventriloquized through already discredited figures. So what the media does, it spends years, if not decades, discrediting certain political figures, be it Chavez, be it Maduro, be it Ortega, be it Rousseff, be it Lula. And it will finally only actually report factually when ventriloquized through these discredited figures. So let's say Nicolas Maduro said that sanctions are having a devastating effect on Venezuela. Now this is a self-evident fact, but the content of the message is discredited because they ventriloquize it through somebody that they've been bastardizing for many years. So yeah, to conclude, we need to be ready for the pushback that's coming against this second pink tide, this second wave of the pink tide. And the media is going to play a fundamental role in shaping people's perceptions on the success of the coming leftist governments. So yeah, it's important. You know, the BBC is not an ally of radical popular movements in Latin America. The Guardian is not an ally of radical popular movements in Latin America. And we need to remember that when we're reading it. Cheers.